I thought my wife was just spending time at her local club, sharing recipes and harmless gossip. But when she started pulling away from me, I followed her, only to uncover a betrayal so deep, it would destroy everything we had built for the past 20 years. Sometimes we get so caught up in something that we don't even realize how completely it consumes us, pulling us deeper and deeper until we start making mistakes. And by the time we try to step back and fix everything, it's already too late. I've seen plenty of people lose themselves in their passions, dedicating every spare moment to their hobbies. My own family wasn't an exception to this. My wife, Piper, and I have lived in a cozy little house in a quiet town in a sunny state for almost 20 years. A long time ago she found something she loved, our local homemakers club. It was a place where women could swap their best recipes, experiment with new dishes, and of course indulge in endless gossip. Piper became a regular, stopping by almost every day for hours at a time. Despite this, she still managed to keep up with all her responsibilities at home. When our daughter, Melanie, graduated high school and moved to another city for college, Piper started dedicating even more time to the club. At first, I didn't mind. In fact, I sometimes appreciated the quiet. After a long, exhausting day at work, it was nice to come home to some peace. But lately, something felt different. It was subtle at first, a shift I couldn't quite put my finger on. Piper seemed more distant, almost as if she wasn't really here even when she was standing right in front of me. At first, I chalked it up to my imagination. I had grown so used to her always being around, always available, that maybe I was just overreacting. But the more time passed, the more I realized it wasn't just in my head. She wasn't just spending time at the club, she was completely consumed by it. One evening, I came home from work and found her in the kitchen. Something about the way she was focused on her phone, absent-mindedly stirring a pot on the stove, made me decide to finally bring it up. I wasn't trying to control her or tell her to stop, but I missed my wife. I wanted her to be fully present again, not just a person I shared a house with. "Piper, can we talk?" I asked hesitantly. She glanced up at me, surprised. "Of course, what's wrong?" I sighed. "It's just, I feel like you're not here anymore. I know you love the club and I never had a problem with it before, but it's like you've given all of yourself to it. We barely talk. When did our family become second to this hobby of yours?" She blinked in shock, her cheeks flushing slightly. "Richard, that's nonsense. What makes you think I don't love you anymore?" "That's not what I'm saying," I said, shaking my head. "But you've changed, Piper. You spend all your time there. I feel like I barely see you anymore." She set her spoon down, crossing her arms. "You never had an issue with it before. Why are you suddenly making this a big deal?" "Because it is a big deal. I miss you. I miss us." Her expression hardened. "You're overreacting. This club is where I relax, where I get to do something for myself. Nobody's stopping you from going out with your friends at the bar, so why are you making such a fuss about where I spend my time?" I could feel the frustration bubbling up inside me, but I bit my tongue. The conversation was only just beginning, but I had a sinking feeling that neither of us was truly ready to hear what the other had to say. "I don't go there every single day," Piper shot back, her voice laced with frustration. "And you've changed, Richard. You've become so distant, so cold. I barely recognize you anymore." Her words stung, but I refused to back down. "Where is the Piper I've loved all my life? The woman I've spent years building a life with?" "Nonsense," she muttered, shaking her head as she turned and walked away, leaving me standing there. I didn't regret asking her about it, I had every right to. But her reaction lingered in my mind. It wasn't just avoidance, it felt like real detachment. Had she truly grown distant, or was I just seeing things that weren't there? Yes, we weren't young anymore, but we weren't old either. I wasn't asking for much, just the presence of my wife, the warmth we used to share. Yet, it felt like she was slipping away from me, and even the most basic parts of our marriage had started to fade. Whenever I tried to get close to her, she always had an excuse. She was tired, had a headache, wasn't in the mood. At first, I didn't push. I told myself that people go through phases, that maybe she was just stressed. But the more she pulled away, the harder it became to ignore. And now, after her dismissive reaction, I felt like I had no choice but to figure out what was really going on. Later that evening, I followed her into the kitchen. I wrapped my arms around her waist, trying to hold her close, to remind her that I was still here, that I still loved her just as much as I always had. To me, she was as beautiful as ever. Time had done nothing to change the way I saw her. She was my wife, the woman I had chosen, the woman I still adored. But Piper immediately tensed. She wriggled out of my embrace, her movements sharp, almost panicked. When she turned to face me, her eyes were filled with something I hadn't seen before: irritation. maybe even anger. "Have you completely lost your mind?" she snapped, her voice colder than I'd ever heard it. I stared at her, my heart sinking. That look in her eyes, it wasn't exhaustion, it wasn't stress. It was something else entirely. And I couldn't ignore it anymore. No matter what, I needed to understand what had changed. I had to know what, exactly, had drawn her so deeply into that club and taken her away from me. The next day I put my plan into motion. I knew when she was leaving, so I called her in advance, making sure she was actually heading to her club. She answered casually, confirming she was on her way, her voice as smooth as ever. At work, I asked a colleague to cover for me and drove straight to the address where their meetings were held. It was strange, I had never once thought to visit before. Why hadn't I? Why had I just let her disappear there for hours at a time without questioning it? The place itself was nothing special, an old, single-story house at the far end of town. It looked ordinary, even abandoned from a distance. But as I stepped inside, I was immediately met with the sound of voices. Women laughing, chatting, their words blending together in an indistinct murmur. I stood in the hallway listening. Somewhere in one of those rooms, Piper was in the middle of a world I knew nothing about. And for the first time, I was going to find out exactly what that world was. I stepped inside and took a quick glance around the room. A handful of women were sitting together, chatting and sipping tea. The moment they saw me, their conversation came to an abrupt stop, their faces filled with surprise. Clearly, they hadn't expected me to show up. "I actually came to see Piper. Is she here?" I asked without hesitation. There was a brief pause before Clara, one of Piper's closest friends, spoke up. "No, Richard, she hasn't arrived yet," she said, tilting her head slightly. Then, as if trying to ease the awkwardness, she added, "Come on in, would you like some tea?" Her politeness didn't fool me. I wasn't here for small talk. And now, I was even more suspicious. Piper had told me she was already at the club when I called earlier. But if she wasn't here, then she had lied. What was she hiding? I forced a small smile, thanked Clara, and quickly made my way toward the exit. The moment I got back in my car, I pulled out my phone and dialed Piper's number. She answered after a few rings. "Piper, when will you be back from your club?" I asked, keeping my voice casual. "I don't know," she replied smoothly. "We're right in the middle of something." "Why?" I gripped the steering wheel tighter. She was lying, without hesitation, without a single stumble in her voice. She wasn't even at the club, yet she was making it sound like she was. "Nothing," I said, forcing my tone to stay light. "I just wanted to spend the evening with you. Yesterday was rough and I was hoping we could have a nice time together. I'm getting off work early today and, well, I even got you a little gift." It wasn't true, but I knew one thing about Piper: she loved gifts. Even the smallest trinket could catch her interest. There was a brief silence before she answered. "Oh, that's sweet," she said, her tone shifting ever so slightly. "But I won't be home for another 2 hours." She had taken the bait. Now all I had to do was play along. I stopped by a nearby store and grabbed a simple little gift. Something inexpensive but nice enough to keep up the act. When I got home, I sat down, my mind racing with possibilities. I had originally planned to confront her the moment she walked through the door, demanding the truth. But now I realized that wouldn't work. If she was already lying to me this easily, she'd just keep lying. No, I had to act as if I knew nothing. I had to pretend I suspected nothing. Only then could I catch her slipping. So, when she walked through the door at the exact time she said she would, I put on my best smile and prepared myself. The real game was just beginning. When Piper walked through the door, I greeted her warmly, doing my best to appear completely at ease. She barely returned the gesture before her eyes lit up with curiosity. "So," she asked almost immediately, "what did you get me?" I smiled and handed her the small brooch, a simple butterfly, its wings shimmering under the light. Normally, she would have gasped with excitement over even the smallest trinket. But this time her reaction was different. She took it, turned it over in her hands and let out a quiet sigh. "That's it?" she said, her tone flat. I raised an eyebrow. "I thought you'd like it. You've always loved little things like this." "That was before," she said dismissively. "You should have noticed by now that cheap jewelry doesn't impress me anymore." Her words hit me like a slap. It wasn't about the brooch, it was about the way she said it. There was no warmth, no gratitude, not even the polite smile she usually gave when a gift wasn't exactly to her taste. It was like she didn't even care to pretend anymore. I tried to fix the moment, reaching out to pull her into a hug, but she quickly stepped back. "I'm tired," she muttered, avoiding my gaze. For a second I just stood there watching her. My gut told me something was wrong, very wrong. Still I kept my voice even. "How was your day?" I asked, trying to sound casual. She let out a breath, barely looking at me. "Oh, dull as ever," she said. "We just shared recipes, nothing exciting." I studied her carefully as she spoke, and for the first time in my life, I saw her lie to me without even blinking. There was no hesitation, no guilt. She was completely unfazed. Later, as she busied herself in the kitchen preparing dinner, I sat on the couch, lost in thought. I went over every little thing that had changed, the distance, the secrecy, the way she pulled away from me. And no matter how I tried to reason with myself, only one possibility made sense. There was someone else. I had never been the jealous type. In all our years together, I never had a reason to doubt her. But now, everything was different. And what baffled me most was the timing. Why now? She wasn't young anymore, and yet she was suddenly acting like a woman with a secret to protect. It didn't matter. Whatever the truth was, I was going to find out. To do that, I needed time. I took a few days off work but still left the house as usual, making it seem like nothing had changed. In reality, I was preparing to uncover whatever Piper was hiding once and for all. Finished thinking. I couldn't let Piper find out that I was following her. If she knew, she'd become even more careful and I'd never get to the truth. So I played it cool. When she got ready for her usual club meetings, I acted as if I wasn't paying attention, casually going about my own routine. But as soon as she left the house, I quietly slipped into my car and followed her. For the first 2 days, everything seemed normal. She drove straight to the club, met with the other housewives, and spent her usual few hours there. I started to question my own suspicions. Maybe I had let my paranoia get the best of me. Maybe, just maybe, Piper was planning something innocent, like a surprise for our upcoming anniversary. The thought lingered in my mind, and I almost abandoned my plan altogether. But on the third day, everything changed. This time, Piper didn't take her usual route. Instead, she turned in the opposite direction, heading toward a part of town we rarely visited. My heartbeat quickened as I stayed a few cars behind, careful not to be noticed. She drove for several kilometers before finally pulling into a quiet alley and parking near an unremarkable house. I watched as she stepped out of the car, adjusted her hair, and pulled something from her purse. My stomach twisted. She wasn't meeting friends. She wasn't at any club. She was here for something else. I waited, barely breathing, as she approached the door and slid a key into the lock. A key. That was all I needed to see. I jumped out of my car and stormed toward the house, my footsteps heavy with anger. I didn't care if she heard me. I didn't care about anything anymore. As I burst through the door, the scene before me confirmed my worst fears. Piper stood frozen, her blouse half off, her wide, terrified eyes staring at me. And across the room, a man, some stranger, was just as caught off guard, his hands still reaching for her. I felt a surge of fury I had never known before. "So this is your club?" I hissed through clenched teeth, my voice dripping with rage. "This is what you've been doing all this time?" Piper said nothing. She just stood there, her mouth slightly open, unable to find a single excuse. My eyes snapped to the man. "And who the hell are you?" I didn't wait for an answer. I lunged at him. I didn't care who he was, what his story was. All that mattered was that he had his hands on my wife. He was bigger than me, but I had the advantage of pure, unfiltered rage. My fists connected with his jaw, and we tumbled onto the floor, struggling against each other. Furniture crashed around us, but I barely noticed. At some point, Piper screamed, begging us to stop. But I wasn't listening. Eventually, the guy managed to push me off him and scrambled to his feet, holding up his hands in surrender. "Wait. Just stop for a second," he gasped, wiping blood from his lip. I was breathing heavily, my fists still clenched, ready to go at him again. But something in his tone made me pause. "Who are you?" I demanded again, my chest rising and falling with fury. He sighed and ran a hand through his hair, keeping a cautious distance. "My name is Daniel," he muttered. "I've only been in town for a couple of months. I came here for my grandfather's funeral and decided to stay a bit longer to fix up his old house before selling it." I frowned, still on edge. "So what? That doesn't explain why my wife is here with you." His expression was unreadable. "I don't know what to tell you, man," he said. "We met, we started talking, and it just happened. Just happened." The words made my stomach churn. Piper knew he was only passing through town. She knew there was no future with him. So why had she done this? What had she been hoping for? Daniel wasn't rich. He didn't have some exciting, glamorous life. His house was nothing special, just an old place he was fixing up. So why? What was it about him that made her throw away everything we had built over the years? I left Daniel alone, glaring at him one last time before turning away. "Stay away from my wife," I warned, my voice low and filled with fury. I didn't care who he was, didn't care about his excuses. He was nothing to me. He needed to disappear. But my anger was far from gone. It was bubbling inside me, barely contained, and when I turned back to Piper, I could feel it reaching its boiling point. "Why, Piper?" I demanded, my voice shaking with rage. "Why did you do this?" She flinched, eyes wide with panic. It's not my fault," she stammered, tears welling up. "He seduced me. I didn't want this. I swear, Richard, I was just caught up in the moment." I let out a bitter laugh, shaking my head. "Lies. More lies. Do you even hear yourself?" She had deceived me so many times before, spinning excuses, pretending everything was fine. But now I could see right through her. I was done believing in the version of her I had once trusted. I stepped closer, grabbing a handful of her hair, forcing her to face me. "Look me in the eye and tell me the truth," I growled. "Tell me why you threw everything away." She sobbed, struggling in my grip, her eyes darting everywhere except at me. It was pathetic. I felt the storm of emotions inside me swirl and crash, desperate to break free. My hands trembled, my entire body screaming to lash out, to do something, anything to make sense of the betrayal. But deep down, I knew if I lost control now, there would be no coming back from it. I let go of her and stepped back, breathing heavily. The walls of that small, suffocating room felt like they were closing in on me, so I did the only thing I could do. I turned and walked away. I stormed out, barely able to think straight, my fists clenched so tightly that my nails dug into my palms. I needed something, an escape, a release. As I passed a table near the door, my rage got the best of me. In one swift motion, I swiped my arm across it, sending a small trinket box flying to the floor. The crash barely satisfied me, but it was something, some small outlet for the fire raging inside me. I needed a drink. I drove aimlessly for a while before finding the nearest pub. Stepping inside, I headed straight for the bar, ordering whatever was strongest. The alcohol didn't help. If anything, it only dulled my movements, making my limbs heavy while the anger inside me stayed sharp and alive. I stepped outside for some air, my mind clouded with frustration. I wanted someone to push me, to provoke me. Just one wrong look, one careless remark, and I'd have an outlet for everything boiling inside me. But no one did. I wandered through the streets, eventually finding myself near the train station. That's when I ran into Bill, an old friend of mine. He had just arrived in town, his bag slung over his shoulder, heading home from the station. "Richard?" he called out, noticing me. I barely acknowledged him. I didn't want to talk, didn't want to explain. But somehow we ended up walking together. When we got to his place, he offered me coffee, but I shook my head. "Whiskey," I muttered. Bill hesitated but poured me a glass without a word. He set it in front of me, crossing his arms. "I don't want to see you drink yourself into the ground," he said. I took a slow sip before replying. "Thanks, buddy. But I'm feeling pretty awful right now." He studied me for a moment. "Then tell me. Maybe I can help." I let out a hollow chuckle, staring at my glass. "Unlikely," I murmured. "I thought my life was solid. I had a family. A good one. I thought we were happy, but now it's all falling apart and I don't know where to go from here." Bill didn't say anything right away. He just listened. And for the first time that night, I felt the weight of everything pressing down on me, heavier than ever. I had no idea what came next. I turned to Stephanie, Bill's wife, and asked her directly, "What exactly do you all do in that club? What are these disputes really about?" Her expression shifted instantly. She hadn't expected me to ask, and for a brief moment, I saw hesitation in her eyes. That's when I knew she was hiding something. Bill, sensing the tension, looked at her suspiciously. "Stephanie, what's he talking about?" She hesitated, glancing between us as if trying to decide whether to speak. Her gaze wandered, avoiding mine, revealing that she knew far more than she was willing to admit. I leaned in. "Stephanie, please. If you know something about Piper, you need to tell me." She exhaled deeply, shaking her head. "Richard, this shouldn't have happened," she murmured. That was all I needed to hear. I stood up, barely hearing the rest of their conversation. I bid Bill farewell and called a taxi to take me home. But before I left, Bill stopped me. "Listen, man, don't do anything stupid," he warned. I nodded, forcing a small smile. "Of course not," I lied. He sighed but let me go. As I sat in the taxi, I realized he was right about one thing: I couldn't act recklessly. If I wanted justice, if I wanted Piper and everyone else responsible to pay for what they had done to me, I had to be smart about it. When I got home I found Piper exactly where I had left her, on the couch, curled up, her face streaked with tears. She looked like she hadn't moved since I stormed out. The moment she saw me, she rushed forward, practically throwing herself at my feet. "Richard, please," she sobbed. "I'm so sorry. I made a mistake, please forgive me." I didn't respond. I just stood there watching her, my heart hollow. The woman begging at my feet wasn't the same woman I had spent years building a life with. Ignoring her, I pulled out my phone and dialed Bill again. "I need you to find out everything you can about this guy," I said as soon as he answered. Bill sighed but didn't argue. "I'll see what I can do. Just, don't do anything reckless." "Just do what I asked," I replied before hanging up. Piper had been standing there, watching me. She looked awful, her face was pale, her hair a mess, her eyes swollen from crying. She looked like she hadn't slept all night. "What?" I finally said, staring down at her. She said nothing. Instead, she turned and grabbed her purse from the table. I immediately stepped in front of her, blocking her path. "Where are you going?" "To the store," she said flatly. "We're missing something for lunch." I narrowed my eyes. Something about her tone felt off. I didn't believe her for a second. Meanwhile, Bill had been working on finding out more about the man Piper had betrayed me with. When he finally called me back, his voice was serious. "Richard, I dug up some info," he said. "His name is Greg Makers. He really did come here to sell his grandfather's house. But get this, on the eve of the sale he suddenly canceled everything, no explanation. That alone was strange, but what Bill said next made my skin crawl. There's something shady about him," he continued. "Some townspeople suspect he's been conning people, either running scams on properties or tricking lonely older women into giving him money. But there's no solid proof." I clenched my jaw. "If that's true, then what does he want here?" "I don't know," Bill admitted. "But one thing's clear, this guy isn't just some random visitor." My fists tightened. Piper had thrown away our marriage for this man, a stranger with a questionable past. And I wasn't going to stop until I uncovered every last detail of what was really going on. I had known Greg's grandfather. He was an old man who had lived in town for years. But to say he had any kind of hidden treasures? That seemed like a stretch. Still, curiosity got the best of me and I decided to confront Greg directly. If there was any truth to these rumors, I wanted to hear it from him. I parked near his house that evening and waited, hoping he'd show up. Hours passed. My body grew stiff from sitting too long, and just as I was about to call it a night, I realized something: Greg wasn't coming back. Had he run away after what happened? Frustrated and restless, I drove to a friend's place. When I arrived, he greeted me with a knowing look. "I take it you're still trying to figure out where Piper is?" "Yeah," I muttered, running a hand through my hair. "I thought she'd gone to him, but they weren't there." My friend, Marv, took a sip of his beer and nodded. "Don't worry, I'll look into it tomorrow. We'll figure it out." We sat there for a while, drinking and talking, and for the first time in days I felt a little lighter. But the relief was temporary. No amount of alcohol could erase the reality of my wife's betrayal. Deep down, I was already preparing myself for the end of our marriage, accepting that I might never see her again. But when I got home, there she was. Piper was in the kitchen, cooking as if nothing had happened. I stopped in the doorway, momentarily stunned. After everything, after the lies, the betrayal, she was here? Acting like we were just another ordinary couple having a normal evening? I clenched my fist. "You're back," I said, my voice colder than I intended. She glanced at me, hesitant. "Yes. I thought I'd make dinner." I didn't say anything. I just stood there, watching her, trying to make sense of what was happening. Meanwhile, Marv had been digging deeper into Greg's background, and what he found was more than suspicious. Apparently, Greg's grandfather had lived a quiet life, keeping to himself. But according to Marv, there had always been rumors, whispers that he had valuables hidden somewhere in his house. If that was true, then Greg wasn't just here to sell the place. He was here to find whatever his grandfather had left behind. And how better to gain access to the house than by getting close to someone from the club? "It makes sense," I told Marv when we talked again. "But how do we prove it?" Marv smirked. "We pay the place a visit." Luckily, that day the club had a scheduled break, meaning there would only be one woman inside, handling basic maintenance. It was the perfect opportunity. When we arrived, we found the woman, one of the club members, visibly shaken. She told us that Greg had been acting strangely, pressing her with questions, demanding to know where some stash was hidden. "He kept saying there was something valuable here," she whispered, her hands trembling. "But I don't know what he's talking about." Greg had spent so much time here searching, but whatever he was looking for, he still hadn't found it. That's when Marv suggested checking the basement. We carefully made our way down the stairs, our footsteps slow and deliberate. The deeper we went, the more uneasy I felt. And then we heard it, rustling sounds from the darkness ahead. We crouched low and peered into the dimly lit space. There, in the middle of the basement, was Greg. He was digging frantically, tearing apart the walls, the floor, anywhere he thought something might be hidden. Dirt and debris were scattered everywhere. It was clear he had been searching for a while. But the real question was, had he found what he was looking for? And more importantly, what would he do when he realized we were watching? I didn't hesitate. The moment I saw Greg digging through the basement, I charged forward. He barely had time to react before I grabbed him by the collar and slammed him against the wall. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" I growled, my fists clenched. Greg stammered, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape. But there was none. Marv was right behind me, arms crossed, his glare as sharp as mine. Greg knew he was caught. Eventually, after some back and forth, he confessed. He had heard rumors about his grandfather hiding valuables in the house, and he had used Piper to get closer to the club, hoping to uncover the supposed fortune. But after all his searching, he had found nothing. The treasure, if it even existed, was still a mystery. The realization hit me like a brick. Piper had betrayed me for nothing. She had risked everything, our marriage, our life together, all for a man who didn't even want her, just access to the club. And now she had nothing to show for it but shame. The aftermath. Piper was devastated. When I confronted her, she broke down, sobbing, saying she had been blinded by the excitement, that she had been a fool to believe in Greg's empty charm. She begged for forgiveness, swearing she would do anything to make things right. But I wasn't ready to forgive. I moved her out of our home, setting her up in a small house on the other side of town. I wasn't ready to let her back into my life, but I wasn't going to throw her into the streets either. If she wanted to prove she was worthy of redemption, she'd have to do it over time. And she tried. She quit the club, cut ties with everyone involved, and spent every day trying to make up for what she had done. But whether I could ever truly forgive her, I didn't know. A new betrayal. Just last week, I found out that my 24-year-old fiancé, yes, a completely different story, had cheated on me with her boss. The guy was at least in his mid-40s, and from what I could gather, he was married. It's almost ironic. After everything I had been through, I somehow found myself back in the same situation. Tomorrow, everything is going to change. I can't say I have any sympathy left in me. Ever since I found out, I've been going through her texts and emails, and each one feels like a knife straight to my heart. 3 years together, all gone in an instant. But if there's anything to be thankful for, it's that I found out before we got married. At least I was spared that much. She has no idea what's coming. Tomorrow I'm taking the day off work. Once she leaves for her job, I'm going to pack up every single thing she owns and toss it out of my place. She'll come home to find her entire world shattered, just like she did to me. When I first saw the emails and figured out what was happening, I called my sister right away. I had to tell someone. I needed someone in my corner. She told me to stay strong and even offered to come over and keep me company while I dealt with everything. That helped. But the hardest part was the conversation I had with my ex-fiancé's mom. It was brutal. This woman had done nothing to deserve the pain in her voice when I told her what her daughter had done. Her whole family had welcomed me in with open arms, treated me like their own, and now I had to break their hearts too. At one point I completely lost it. I flat out asked my fiancée if she even realized what she had put me through, how humiliating it was that I now had to go get tested for STDs because of her betrayal. Could she even imagine how disgusting that felt? At least she didn't try to deny it. I told her she needed to come by this afternoon and pick up her stuff because we were done. She tried to argue, saying we'd have a proper talk later, but I shut that down fast. There's nothing left to talk about, I told her. My sister is already helping me sort out changing the locks. With any luck, that'll be done by tonight or tomorrow morning. And just like that, another chapter of my life is closing. Another betrayal, another lesson learned. I don't know what the future holds, but one thing is certain. This time, I'm not leaving room for second chances. I know this post is all over the place, but my mind's racing and I'm just trying to get everything out. Well, it's done. She's out of my life. She came over today with her mom and best friend to collect some of her things. My sister was there too, watching the whole thing unfold. No screaming, no arguing. She asked if we could talk alone, but I shut that down immediately. There was nothing left to say. Before leaving, she placed a letter on my coffee table, an apology, no doubt. I haven't even touched it. I don't want to see whatever excuses she's written down, trying to justify what she did. She's coming back tomorrow with her dad to pick up the rest of her stuff. My sister muttered that she'd love to yank her hair out by the roots, her words, not mine. But honestly, I don't even have the energy for anger anymore. Right now, I just want to lie down and sleep, let the exhaustion take over for a while. Another betrayal, another story. My wife, my now ex-wife, had always been deeply connected with the women in our neighborhood. She thrived in social circles, had her hands in every little event, and I just assumed it was part of who she was. But then, Samantha, one of the women from her group, called me with a strange concern. Apparently, my wife had been completely off the radar. And she wasn't the only one noticing. She had been in the middle of planning a charity 5K to raise money for struggling families in our area. She was always the type to be involved in things like that, so it didn't seem out of the ordinary, until she suddenly disappeared. She told one of the women that she needed space, and then went completely silent. That's when a particular detail caught my attention. Samantha mentioned that the event was being hosted by Virginia, a close friend of my wife's, one I had heard of before. And that's when something clicked. Just 3 days ago, Virginia had posted on Facebook about leaving for a week-long trip. My wife had commented on it, wishing her a safe journey. That meant the event was still happening, but without Virginia. So where the hell was my wife? My heart started pounding. My palms were sweaty. I gripped the steering wheel tighter as I realized I was about to walk straight into something I wasn't ready for. The confrontation. I pulled up to the address my gut had been screaming at me to check. My wife sat beside me, acting nervous, too nervous. I played it cool, just giving her a grin as I walked up to the front door. She hesitated, frozen in place as I knocked firmly. The door swung open, revealing a man standing there in a plush robe embroidered with his initials. At first he looked pleased, until he saw me. That smug look on his face disappeared in an instant. "Hello there," I greeted him smoothly, stepping forward as if I owned the place. My wife was still behind me, visibly shaking. Ippy, let's call him that, was caught completely off guard. His expression twisted into one of panic, and his voice wavered as he tried to act like nothing was wrong. But I wasn't here for games. "I think you and I need to talk," I said, walking past him into his house without waiting for an invitation. Panic turned to anger. Ippy wasn't having it. He ordered both of us to leave, practically shoving us toward the front door. Just before he could slam it shut, I turned and dropped a single sentence that made him freeze. "It wouldn't be good if someone told your wife about this, would it?" His hand stopped mid-motion. He locked eyes with me, trying to read my intentions. "I'm not here to make a scene," I continued. "I just need something from you, evidence. Proof of your affair with my wife so I can use it in the divorce." He hesitated, torn between his own self-preservation and the mess he had just been dragged into. "You might want to consider cooperating," I added, lowering my voice. "Because if you don't, I have no problem making sure your wife finds out in a much messier way." AP swallowed hard. He knew I wasn't bluffing. The fallout. In the end, everything unraveled fast. Virginia, the so-called best friend, was the one who ended up exposing my ex-wife even further. Turns out she had her own vendetta. She was the one who had slashed my ex's car tires and carved an insult into the hood. She had known all along what was happening, and when the truth came out, she wanted to make sure my ex paid for it. AP and my ex-wife's affair was out in the open. His marriage crumbled. My wife's reputation was completely destroyed. She lost everything: her husband, her social circle, her home, even her so-called friends. Now, at 46, she has nothing to show for it. And I walked away with my dignity intact. And that, more than anything, is what matters.